Under the crimson twilight sky of Volzara, I found myself pressed against the rocky outcrop behind the crumbling watchtower. Dust from the desert plateau swirled around me with every gust of wind, catching the fading light and transforming the evening into a haze of blood-orange luminescence. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced over a collapsed section of stone wall, eyes narrowed in determination. I was not supposed to be here, sneaking about a territory claimed by outlaws, but desperation had urged me onward. Somewhere beneath that broken watchtower's rubble lay an ancient magical item, rumored to be broken and near useless. But I had uncovered secrets in a dusty tome that said otherwise, that the item could be restored, and when it was, it could serve as a gateway to knowledge no mortal had ever fully grasped. And so, with the last of the sunlight drifting behind me, I steeled myself and made my move. People often peg me as a reckless adventurer, and perhaps they're right. But it wasn't always so. My name is Elias Morvain, an erstwhile scholar who once served as a record keeper for a prestigious mages academy in the city of Nurkora. For decades, I was content to remain behind dusty shelves, meticulously cataloging spells, incantations, ancient tomes, and artifact blueprints. Then my thirst for arcane knowledge began to stir a deeper yearning for adventure, a yearning that all the academic pursuits in the world could never quench. The day I left that safe library behind, I heard plenty of warnings from my colleagues. Stay where it's safe, they said. Don't risk your life seeking relics from the old war, they pleaded. But something in my bones told me I needed to see for myself, to press my hands on the remnants of that old magic, to breathe life back into relics that had been cast aside by civilizations long dead. That hunger for discovery propelled me to the watchtower outside Volzara, where I had heard rumors that a pair of outlaws possessed pieces of a legendary device. A teleporter, the story said. Intricate illusions that swirl space and time itself, rumored to be just a broken chunk of metal now. But I knew better. As I crouched behind that rocky outcrop, I peered across the courtyard. A crack in the tower's foundation revealed a subterranean chamber, partially collapsed, where two figures hunched over a makeshift camp. Smoke from a feeble campfire drifted into the sky. The pungent aroma of burnt rodent flesh mixed with the dry smell of desert dust. My informant had claimed these outlaws were part of a criminal guild, muscle for hire, but cunning enough to hold on to relics with potential value. Shifting my weight carefully, I crept closer. I pulled my hood low, my heart in my throat. My breath felt like fire in my lungs with every silent footfall. At first glance, neither looked especially threatening, no bulging demons, no hulking warlords. One was a man dressed in heavy robes, a tradesman type with a condescending air. His posture was stiff, and his movements spoke of a certain meticulousness, almost like a craftsman obsessed with details. The other was leaner, wearing light leather armor with two daggers strapped across his chest. He exuded the edgy confidence of an adventurer down on his luck. For a moment, it seemed they were both absorbed in a private conversation about smuggling routes. I thought I might slip by them easily. After all, I'd practiced stealth incantations for months in the library corridors, to slip past the archivist whenever I wanted to read after curfew. With any luck, that practice would pay off now. I inhaled, whispered a quick prayer to any benevolent spirit that might lend me fortune, and made my move, creeping around the perimeter of the courtyard. Step by step, I kept to the shadows, placing my feet carefully over stray pebbles. My ears pounded with the sounds of my own heartbeat, and with every inch forward, I expected a sudden alarm. But nothing. My luck held. As though guided by an unseen hand, I navigated the uneven ground, slipped around a half-toppled statue, and reached the scattered pieces of the broken artifact. I could see, even in the low light, that these fragments were exquisite. A filigree of swirling runes curled across the surface of the main piece, which was about the size of my palm. Tiny rods and gears accompanied it, each etched with delicate sigils. I repressed the urge to grin. This was exactly what I had been looking for. Gently, and with trembling hands, I scooped up as many pieces as I could find. I tucked them into the hidden pocket inside my cloak, my heart fluttering. Then, as silently as I'd come, I backed away. Perhaps the gods themselves had smiled on me. I was just about to slip behind the broken wall when my foot snagged on a loose stone. A clang of metal on rock echoed through the courtyard. I froze. Both outlaws jerked to attention. "Thief!" yelled the tradesman, eyes igniting with wrath. The adventurer's gaze snapped onto me and he leapt forward. I mentally cursed my clumsiness, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. Survival instincts took over. I pivoted, fumbling with the artifact in my cloak and tried to run. All I needed was a second to slip away into the darkness of the canyon. But I found my path blocked by the outlaw adventurer, whose eyes glinted like a hungry wolf. I managed only a few steps back before his partner, the robed tradesman, flanked me. They cornered me easily, with the skillful formation of men used to dealing with smaller prey. I tried for a dirty trick. Let them come at me from both sides, I thought. If I timed my dodge well, I might leap away at the last second and let them crash into each other. It was a technique I'd read about in an old martial treatise, the kind of opportunistic move favored by thieves and assassins. I jumped into position, tracking the outlaw's movements, waiting for the perfect moment. My pulse thundered in my ears. Now, I yelled, launching myself into an acrobatic side flip. But my foot caught awkwardly on a loose bit of stone, and the entire motion collapsed into a clumsy tumble. Instead of colliding with each other, the outlaws snagged me, one on each arm, and jerked me forcibly upright. Pain seared across my shoulders. My vision blurred for a heartbeat. The shock made me drop the artifact fragments. The robed tradesman, a sneer twisting his lips, instantly released me and lunged for the scattered pieces. The adventurer likewise dove for them, snarling, "You're not taking that, old man." They nearly knocked heads as they reached for the glimmering metal. Freed from their grip, I tried to retaliate. I let out an enraged shout, braced myself, and threw a knee drop aimed at the back of the tradesman's head. "Hammer fall knee," I roared, hoping to make it sound more fearsome than it was. But in my condition, my arms still vibrating with pain, my balance thrown off, I miscalculated the distance. My knee slammed hard into the ground, and the jolt of pain that radiated through my body stole the breath from my lungs. A raw, agonized cry burst from my throat as shock waves of pain rolled up my thigh. The outlaws turned to me, the tradesman's lips curled in mockery. They hefted the pieces triumphantly, and I could see the tradesman was examining them closely, hungry to figure out how to restore them for profit or power. "You think you can claim this for yourself?" The adventurer outlaw hissed at me, stepping closer. He towered over me, battered leather boots scraping the dusty ground. He clutched half the relic in one hand. I cursed under my breath. I had no weapons, only illusions, cunning, and the determination that had brought me this far. I scooped up a handful of dust from the ground, hoping to blind them, but the adventurer was quicker. He lashed out with a brutal kick before I could throw anything. A sharp blow to my ribs sent me sprawling, gasping for air. My mouth filled with the metallic taste of blood. The tradesman, meanwhile, advanced with a wicked gleam in his eye. He hefted the fragments with one hand as if weighing them. Then, with an annoyed flick of his boot, he kicked me in the face. My head snapped back, and dark spots danced in my vision. In desperation, I spat some of the blood from my mouth and tried to flick it into their eyes, anything to buy a second to escape. Blood missed distraction. I barked, giving a dramatic flourish. But the outlaws merely shielded their faces, anticipating the attempt. They stomped down, kicks raining upon me as I curled up to shield my vitals. My entire body felt like it was on fire, and a wave of exhaustion pressed me towards unconsciousness. It was in that dire moment, on the cusp of passing out, that a flicker of memory from my years in the library sparked through my mind, the small device. I had come across an old blueprint for it ages ago. It was said to be less than impressive but could produce illusions of the spiritual realm. I'd stolen the design from the restricted archives and built it myself. It was no bigger than a child's toy, hidden in a side pouch inside my bag. I fumbled for it, every motion agony. My fingertips touched cold metal at last. Gritting my teeth, I pressed the activation rune. Thin arcs of purple energy lit up around me, followed by a swirl of luminous skulls drifting in mid-air. They weren't physically harmful, nothing but illusions, but they looked convincingly real. Eerie, hollow-eyed grins bobbed around me, leaving trails of ghostly purple luminescence. The outlaws froze. They stared wide-eyed at the phantasmal faces. What the? The adventurer stammered, stepping backward. I seized the moment. "You fools!" I rasped with every ounce of intimidation I could muster. "Do you see now the power of the curse of lost souls?" I forced a ragged cackle, even though I tasted blood. The illusions moaned with unholy echoes. The outlaws lost their nerve. I saw the whites of their eyes as they each let out a half-strangled cry and bolted. In their terror, they dropped the scattered artifact pieces. I wanted to shout after them that they would pay for my injuries, but I couldn't quite summon the breath. At least, they were gone. I crawled over to the nearest fragment, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ribs. One by one, with shaking hands, I gathered each piece that had fallen. There weren't many, just the main lattice and a few rods. In the tomes, this device was described as smaller than a dagger's hilt, an unassuming shape that contained complex runic circuits. My battered fingers quivered as I began fitting them together. I felt the faint hum of arcane potential resonate through the metal. If it was truly a teleporter, it would serve as a gateway to secrets even the best alchemists or enchanters had yet to discover. But first, I had to survive. It took every last shred of my concentration to align each piece precisely. The runes glowed with a subdued turquoise light, reminding me of moonlight reflected on a still pond. With a silent flash, the fragments clicked into place. A jolt of mystical energy pulsed through my palms. For a moment, I worried I'd accidentally triggered some self-destruct sequence. But instead, the device let out a soft hum, arcs of magic pulsing around it like rings of translucent light. A grin spread across my face despite the blood and swelling. A teleporter, more or less standard in design, but meticulously crafted and obviously powered by arcane means. Now was the time to see if it really worked. With trembling limbs, I summoned the last of my strength, pressing my thumbs against the swirling glyphs etched onto the device's surface. The runes vibrated with energy. The world around me seemed to stretch like taffy, then with a thunderous crack, everything went white. When my vision returned, I was no longer in the collapsed watchtower courtyard. My feet touched down on a smooth marble floor. The chamber around me was lamplit and serene, medicinal herbs and salves lining shelves. It was an infirmary, a well-stocked one, presumably in one of Volzara's better enclaves. I sagged with relief as a startled cleric rushed over, eyes wide and hands glowing with healing incantations. 2 hours later, I found myself propped up on a simple cot, bandages wrapped around my torso, bruises throbbing but less dire. Soft candlelight glowed along the edges of the infirmary room. The local clerics had done their best to treat my injuries, though they'd demanded a small fortune for the immediate service. I glanced at my gold pouch, less full than I liked, but the pain in my ribs and face had eased enough that I wasn't complaining. I pulled the teleporter from my cloak pocket, the runes still pulsing faintly, though more gently than before. It was, in essence, a run-of-the-mill teleportation device, except it radiated a deeper well of magic than I'd ever felt. That was the knowledge I had come for, the secret rumored in old texts. And it was now in my possession. I rested my head back against the thin pillow, letting a sigh of exhaustion slip out. My immediate problem was solved, but questions buzzed through my mind. Why had these outlaws wanted the device so badly? And what was the tradesman's real motivation? Perhaps money alone was not the only factor. The illusions might have scared them away today, but I suspected they would regroup soon enough. They wouldn't have fled forever just because of a handful of purple skull illusions. They might even return with reinforcements. Even so, for that night, my biggest concern was mending my body, stabilizing my mind, and beginning my deeper study of the teleporter's runes. The cleric on duty, a tired-looking middle-aged woman with pale skin and golden hair braided back, approached me. She had a warm, gentle presence. "Sir," she said softly. "You're lucky to be alive. You should remain here until morning. Then, if you need to travel, do so with great care." I nodded and thanked her, though I avoided telling her the deeper secrets of my near-death escapade. Instead, I traced my fingertips over the delicate runes etched into the device. Something told me this was only the beginning. Sleep claimed me in short bursts that night, haunted by dreams of swirling illusions, purple skulls cackling through dark corridors, and the outlaws' mocking faces. By dawn, I was on my feet again, ignoring the cleric's advice to rest more. My body ached, but the unstoppable curiosity of a scholar gnawed at me. Once I had a clearer sense of how the teleporter functioned, it could open realms of possibility. Perhaps I could track down even more hidden arcs of knowledge from the ancient war. I pictured entire libraries of lost incantations, sealed behind wards that only a teleporter might bypass. The risk was worth it, my heart soared with excitement that overshadowed the bruises. Still limping slightly, I exited the infirmary into the bustling market square of Volzara's eastern district. Countless stalls lined the stone-paved streets, hawking everything from spiced meats to magical trinkets. The smell of sizzling exotic fish mingled with the perfume of desert flowers, all under the rising sun's golden beams. But I moved through the crowd like a ghost, ears alert, scanning for any hint of the outlaws. To my relief, they were nowhere in sight. Before I ventured beyond the city walls, though, I needed more context. The device in my hands was no mere toy, and it might draw the wrong kind of attention if I wasn't careful. So I sought out an old friend, a half-elf named Sienna, an expert in glyph weaving who ran a modest enchantment shop. She was arguably my closest confidant in Volzara, a woman who had left the cloistered life of a monastic scriptorium to pursue her own brand of enchantment in the city. Tall and slender, with dark hair braided in an intricate pattern, she greeted me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You look like you wrestled with a Gorgath beast," she remarked, eyebrows rising. "Please tell me you weren't dabbling with necromancy again." I snorted. "Nothing so dramatic. Some outlaws battered me half to death while I tried to retrieve this." Carefully, I set the teleporter on her countertop. Her silver eyes widened, and she ran her fingers over the swirling runes. I explained, in whispered detail, how I had discovered it was broken but had since reassembled it, and how I suspected it held deeper secrets. Sienna nodded thoughtfully, occasionally muttering arcane phrases under her breath to test the teleporter's aura. After several minutes, she frowned. It's definitely a teleportation device, and yes, well crafted. But there's more. These runes have multiple layers of encryption. See here? She traced a slender finger along a line of glyphs that I hadn't even noticed. It's as though the item has a personality. Or a living will. Reminds me of the old stories where relics can bond with their user. Her words sent a thrill through me. Living will? So there's knowledge locked in it? Sienna nodded gravely. Potentially. But unraveling it will be dangerous. Such artifacts often come with defenses. If you push too hard, it may bite back with illusions, or worse. I'd guess you already discovered it can do illusions, yes? I chuckled darkly, recalling how I used my own illusions, aided by the device in my bag, to spook the outlaws. Though that was from another device, I admitted. But maybe the teleporter has illusions of its own, too. She stroked her chin. You must approach it carefully. But if you manage to bond with it, you might harness illusions and teleportation from a single artifact. A hush fell between us. The potential was staggering. Before I could respond, her eyes flickered to the entrance behind me. I tensed, turning around to see none other than the two outlaws themselves, standing at the threshold of Sienna's shop. They weren't dressed in the same gear, presumably to mask their identities in the city, but I recognized their faces instantly, the adventurer with that rapacious gleam in his eyes, and the robed tradesman, whose haughty stare lingered on me with cold fury. So, the tradesman said, his voice dripping with contempt. We followed the rumor that someone teleported into an infirmary last night. Knew it had to be you. The adventurer stepped forward, muscles tense. We're taking back that relic. It's property of the Crimson Jackals Guild. Stand aside, or we'll burn this place to the ground. My pulse quickened. Sienna squared her shoulders, preparing for a fight. The tension in the air crackled. I swallowed hard. I had barely recovered from the last beating. But I wasn't alone anymore, and I refused to surrender. Leave now, I warned. Your illusions of grandeur won't serve you here. I clutched the teleporter. Lightly, I traced the runes, preparing for a possible instant warp. But the tradesman's eyes flicked in recognition. He seemed to guess my intention. With a sneer, he brandished a small sphere from within his robes. With a crack, it expanded into a shimmering net of magical energy, anchored around the corners of the shop. A teleporter blocking ward. My stomach dropped. Sienna whispered to me, we'll have to fight, but be careful. They're more dangerous than they look. The tradesman's eyes flared with arcane sparks. Let the entire city hear us, for all I care, he intoned, shifting into a stance reminiscent of a martial enchanter. His arms swept wide, and a swirl of shimmering glyphs danced around him. Artisan's wrath, crashing sledge, he bellowed. Then, as though conjured from thin air, a massive hammer made of swirling, semi-solid runic energy formed in his hands. The adventurer cracked his neck with a grin. Blade cascade, he shouted. He crossed his two daggers in front of him, and an array of ghostly dagger images materialized overhead, each shimmering with a savage aura. Sienna's expression darkened with resolve. She pressed her hands together, calling forth a swirling script of runes that orbit her like a storm of letter shapes. Arcane weave, thousand thread lattice, she cried. A web of glowing lines blossomed from her fingertips, weaving patterns in the air. I couldn't help the exhilaration that coursed through me. It was just like the epic battles of old, dangerous, yes, but there was an electricity in the air that made me feel more alive than ever. Even battered as I was, I let out a fierce cry. Illusory embers, spectral fang slash. I had no real weapon, but by channeling my meager illusions, I conjured a glimmering crescent of ghostly fire that shot from my open palm. Over the top? Absolutely. But in that moment, it was do or die. The outlaws lunged forward. The tradesman swung his hammer of runic energy, the blow smashing into the floor. Stone shards flew, and I barely tumbled aside in time. Sienna retaliated, flinging arcane strands that coiled around the adventurer's conjured daggers, trying to dispel them before they could strike. But the adventurer twisted in mid-air, unleashing a volley of spectral daggers that rained down upon us. One slashed across my shoulder, searing pain ripping through me. Another stabbed into the wooden counter, missing Sienna by inches. Blood trickled down my arm, but I forced myself to remain focused. The tradesman advanced on me, swirling his arcane hammer overhead. Something about the shape of it reminded me of how I once hammered a steel bracket into place for that small illusion device. The robed man's voice boomed with practiced incantation. Masterstroke impact, collapsing anvil. He brought the hammer crashing down. I hurled myself backward, raising both hands, illusions swirling around my fingers. Spectral barrier, flickering veil, I roared, summoning a ragged, translucent shield of purple energy. The hammer struck the barrier, and for a heartbeat, the entire shop blazed with bright runic light. Then the barrier shattered like glass. The blow slammed into me, knocking the wind out of my lungs. I flew across the room, crashing into a shelf of enchanted talismans. They rained down around me in a cacophony of clinks. Sienna faced off against the adventurer, arcs of energy swirling between them. The adventurer bellowed, cutting gale dash. Dashing forward with inhuman speed, he spun, daggers leaving shimmering trails. Sienna raised her hands, weaving a net of arcane threads that slowed him down just enough for her to dodge his lethal slash. She jabbed a glowing finger at him, unleashing a concentrated bolt of runic force. It struck the adventurer in the chest, sending him skidding back with a snarl. I struggled to my feet, ignoring the screaming protests of my muscles. The tradesman advanced again, hammer at the ready. A memory of my old library days flashed in my mind. The best illusions often distract or misdirect the opponent's senses. I was battered and had little left, but maybe that was my advantage. I coughed up blood and gave the tradesman a deranged grin. "You want illusions?" I spat. "Allow me to introduce, Nightmare Waltz." With a flourish of both arms, I channeled the last vestiges of my illusions. Eerie shapes flitted around the tradesman, warped faces, broken mirrors, flickers of color that danced at the edge of his vision. He glanced around, disoriented, unsure which was real. He swung his hammer in wild arcs, smashing illusions that vanished as quickly as they appeared. That gave me a short window of opportunity. I lunged in, ignoring the pain in my ribs, and grabbed hold of the net device anchored to the corners of the shop. The wards glimmered with runic lines. My library studies included ward breaking, though I wasn't an expert. Still, with adrenaline rushing through me, I poured everything I had into a single burst of dispelling magic. "Rune shatter!" I screamed, pressing my hand against the anchor. A sharp light flashed, and I felt the tension in the air snap as the ward dissolved. The tradesman let out a shout of fury as the net collapsed around us. Sienna, still grappling with the adventurer's swirling daggers, caught sight of the ward's collapse. She locked eyes with me in silent understanding. Teleporter was free. I thumbed the activation glyph on the device at my side. The walls of reality twisted, the world around us blurring for a second time. But the tradesman held. "No, you don't." He slammed the butt of his hammer into the teleporter. The blow jostled the runic alignment, sending arcs of disordered energy crackling across the shop. A vortex of swirling lights and shadows enveloped us. Sienna gasped, and I felt my stomach twist as the teleporter's wild magic threatened to tear us apart. Then, with a thunderous pop, we reappeared in some other part of the city, a broad thoroughfare with stalls and startled citizens. The midday sun glared down, and the local guard was out in force, looking utterly perplexed at the sudden appearance of swirling illusions, arcs of runic energy, and 4 battered combatants. The crowd gasped and recoiled. No time to think. The outlaws were just as disoriented as we were. Seizing the moment, Sienna pointed at them, her voice cracking with authority. "Guards! These criminals attacked our shop. They belong to the Crimson Jackals Guild." The adventurers' eyes darted about. Realizing they were outnumbered, both outlaws took off, pushing through the gathering crowd. The city guard gave chase, though it was uncertain if they could catch them. Part of me wanted to follow and finish this once and for all, but I felt my body slump, spent. I sank to my knees, the teleporter clutched in my trembling hand, pain throbbing in every limb. Sienna knelt beside me. "Easy," she said, her voice gentle. "We'll have to keep watch. They'll keep coming if they think they can claim this artifact. But for now, you're safe." I nodded, letting my eyes close, relieved to be alive. In the days that followed, I stayed with Sienna, helping her repair the damage to her shop. The morning after the battle, as I nursed a new set of bruises, she told me she'd uncovered a few more clues about the teleporter's encryption. She believed there was a series of illusions embedded in the device that could open up hidden compartments of knowledge if used correctly. At first, I was intrigued, but each time I thought back to my near-death experience, a wave of uncertainty would pass over me. What was I truly after? More knowledge at any cost? My entire life, I believed that knowledge, especially hidden knowledge, was worth any price, that the pursuit of it would somehow complete me. But now that I'd nearly died for that pursuit, and gotten others endangered in the process, I questioned whether my thirst for relics was misguided. I felt guilt gnawing at my conscience for roping Sienna into a life and death struggle. Even so, I had risked it all for a device that was, in some sense, just a tool. Was knowledge the real treasure, or was it the sense of purpose it gave me? Meanwhile, the outlaws, though driven off, remained a looming threat. The tradesman especially, he had seemed more motivated by some personal quest. I recalled how he spat curses at me, how his foot connected with my face so viciously. His was not merely a lust for coin, but something deeper. The adventurer, on the other hand, looked at the world like a playground for profit. If enough gold were dangled in front of him, maybe he would betray any master. I spent hours mulling over ways I could exploit that. At times, I even considered bribery, but my gold was limited, and the memory of how badly that fight had gone made me wary of tempting fate again. Eventually, at Sienna's urging, I decided to test the teleporter's illusions in a controlled environment, an abandoned courtyard near the city's edge, far from prying eyes. Night had fallen by the time we arrived. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and the full moon bathed the broken cobblestones in silver light. I placed the teleporter on a stone block and knelt beside it, letting my breathing calm. "All right," I muttered. "If this artifact has deeper illusions, let's see." Sienna nodded, producing a spool of enchanted thread to form a barrier around us in case anything went awry. Gently, I traced the secondary runes Sienna had identified. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hum, a swirl of azure light shuddered around the device, forming a faint dome around us. The air thickened, my ears popped. I felt as if I'd stepped into another dimension. Within that dome, flickering shapes began to form, spectral silhouettes of robed figures, their faces masked by swirling glyphs. They seemed to chant in a tongue older than any I'd read. Gradually, the illusions merged together into a single imposing figure, a tall, regal specter, wearing a cloak that shimmered with starlight. "Who seeks the gate of translocation?" A voice echoed, layered with the timbre of centuries. My heart pounded. Was this an imprint of the artifact's original creator? I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat felt dry. "I do," I managed. "Elias Morvain." The specter glided closer, intangible but majestic. It raised a hand, and ghostly lines connected with the teleporter. "Those who seek to master the gate must prove their conviction. Without unwavering resolve, you shall be devoured by your own illusions." Sienna shuffled closer, prepared to intervene if needed. My mind churned with a storm of questions. Did I still have unwavering resolve, after all I'd suffered? Or had I begun to doubt myself? The memory of my savage beating, the fear I felt, my idealism was shaken. Yet I realized something else had blossomed in me, a sense of responsibility, a recognition that knowledge untempered by caution was a path to ruin. "You say unwavering resolve is needed," I said. "But perhaps it's the humility to know one's limits that protects a person from illusions." The specter's eyes, glowing orbs of white flame, bored into me. For an endless moment, it was silent. Then it slowly inclined its head, as though acknowledging a subtle truth. "Very well," it intoned. "Seek within." The illusions around us intensified. I saw swirling images of my younger self, a timid archivist, terrified of the outside world. I saw fleeting pictures of the outlaws, gloating over me. My body trembled. But I felt something anchor me this time. Yes, I had fear, but also a new sense of perspective. This artifact wasn't just a means to personal glory. If used responsibly, it might open realms that could improve countless lives, or preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The illusions threatened to twist my fears, but I stood firm, driven not just by ambition but a tempered purpose. A resonant hum rippled through the air. The specter parted in a swirl of starlight, revealing behind it a labyrinth of runic symbols etched into the night sky like constellations. Then, in a silent flash, the illusions vanished. The teleporter shimmered. I felt a wave of new insight flood my consciousness. I caught glimpses of advanced sigils, how they could be combined with illusions to create stable portals, how illusions themselves could be used to manipulate the shape of space. It was fragmentary knowledge, but it was exhilarating. I could almost hear Sienna gasp behind me. "It recognized your shift in perspective," she whispered. "It saw that you're not just chasing knowledge for personal gain. That's why it granted you a glimpse." I rose slowly, staring at the teleporter now softly pulsing with a deeper light. My entire body shook, part excitement, part fatigue, but also a kind of awe. In the reflection of the device's runes, I no longer saw a desperate archivist chasing relics. I saw someone who understood that the pursuit of knowledge must serve a higher purpose. That maybe I needed to reconcile my thirst for discovery with empathy and caution. In that moment, I realized I had changed. My initial belief, that knowledge was everything, had grown more nuanced. Knowledge, I decided, was only as good as the heart wielding it. Sienna stepped forward, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. We exchanged a brief, warm smile, an unspoken agreement that we would guard the teleporter's secrets as best we could. Then I tucked the device away. We had a long journey ahead, one that involved the Crimson Jackals Guild and their ambitions, and hopefully ended with us preserving the teleporter's gifts for the greater good. I wish that would be the end of my confrontation with the outlaws. But fate had other plans. News came the next day that the Crimson Jackals Guild, alerted by the outlaws who'd confronted me, had put a bounty on my head, a substantial one. Bounty posters with a rough sketch of my face began cropping up around the city. Wanted for theft of guild property, they read. The sum was high enough to attract many mercenaries' attention. The city guard, so often corrupt, might look the other way if I got into trouble. Tension built, and I felt eyes on me wherever I went. That very afternoon, a rumor reached me that the tradesmen had holed up at an abandoned blacksmith's forge just outside Volzara. That apparently was the nerve center for the local branch of the Crimson Jackals. They were preparing for an all-out assault to reclaim the teleporter. Sienna and I realized we needed to act before they ambushed us. The logic was simple: better to face them on our own terms than be cornered. So we gathered supplies, potions, and what magical tools we could muster. I was still battered, but adrenaline coursed through me at the thought of finishing this conflict. We left Volzara at sundown, slipping through the southern gate under the watchful eye of the guard, who offered no objection, likely informed not to get in the guild's way. By nightfall, we arrived at the old forge site. It was set against a rocky slope, a single building that reeked of soot and charcoal even though it had long been abandoned. Rusted machinery lined the yard, and a wrought iron fence stood in partial disrepair around the perimeter. Torchlight flickered from within, revealing shadows moving across the windows. We exchanged a silent nod. Sienna formed an arcane hand sign, indicating we should split up to approach from different sides. I circled around to the left, stepping carefully among the rusted scraps, while she took the right. My heart hammered in my chest. My illusions had gotten me this far, but the guild's numbers could be overwhelming. Then again, if the teleporter truly recognized me as its new user, perhaps I could harness a fraction of its power for a decisive advantage. Clinging to the shadows, I peered through a shattered window. Inside, about half a dozen armed thugs milled about, including the adventurer and the robed tradesman. They were in hushed conversation, examining stolen goods stacked on a makeshift table. I spotted a range of twisted artifacts, potions, and scrolls. My anger rose at the sight. These criminals were hoarding precious knowledge, using it for ill. The tradesman turned, his back to me, that same arrogance radiating from him. He was explaining something in measured, technical language. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard mention of spatial disruption, and cornering that wretch. They were planning on capturing me to forcibly take the teleporter. The adventurer smirked, spinning a dagger on his palm. He looked bored, but his eyes gleamed with greed. I inhaled slowly, a swirl of illusions already churning in my mind. If I could disorient them, we might stand a chance. I nodded to Sienna across the yard. She raised a hand, silently counted down from 3, and on 0, we both unleashed an assault. Sienna's voice cut through the night, Weaver's fury, arcane ribbon storm. Threads of pure magical force burst from her fingertips, whipping around the yard, slicing through the rotted wooden door. It exploded inward, sending shards flying. I leapt through the shattered window, illusions bursting forth around me. Phantom Legion, I roared, conjuring a swirl of faceless soldiers made of violet light, each brandishing spectral swords. Chaos erupted. The guild members shouted in alarm. The tradesman raised a hand, summoning that runic hammer again. The adventurer sprang onto a table, daggers glinting in the torchlight, as his eyes scanned for the best vantage to strike. Several lesser thugs scattered, only to regroup with swords and crossbows. The robed tradesman snarled at me, "We'll finish what we started," and lunged. Sienna's swirling ribbons clashed with crossbow bolts mid-air, snapping them aside. Meanwhile, I commanded my phantom soldiers to press the group from multiple angles. For a moment, it looked as though we might rout them. Then the tradesman roared, "Guild, hold formation." His resonant voice contained a commanding presence that belied his slender form. The guild members steadied themselves, forging a tight defensive ring. The tradesman's runic hammer glowed with scorching arcs of energy. He leapt at one of my Phantom Legion illusions, swinging with savage force. Though intangible illusions, these phantoms had enough arcane substance that the hammer's blow dispersed one in a flash of purple sparks. The adventurer seized the chance to dash in close to me. I turned, forming illusions to distract him, but his reflexes were honed. "Venom vortex," he shouted, a swirling green aura spiraling around his blades. I barely ducked in time as he slashed overhead, his blades leaving sizzling arcs in the air. Pain flared again in my side. My battered ribs threatened to give out. But I needed to push through or risk being overwhelmed. I summoned illusions of clattering chains around his ankles, pure deception. For a split second, the adventurer glanced down, expecting to be ensnared. I seized that opening. I lunged forward, pressing the teleporter's glyph to his chest. With a flash, we disappeared from the forge and reappeared instantly 5 feet away, outside the ring of guild members. Disoriented, he stumbled. I used the momentum to smash my elbow into his temple, feeling a grim satisfaction as he staggered backward. "Damn you," he spat, blood trickling from his lip. He readied his blades again. But Sienna, perched in the open doorway, hurled a volley of arcane ribbons at him, forcing him to roll away. The tradesman advanced on me again, fury etched into every line of his face. He had to suspect that the teleporter was responding to me, but that only seemed to enrage him further. "Foolish archivist," he snarled, reading my past in the battered clothes, the faint smell of parchment still clinging to me. "Your illusions won't save you from the real power of the guild." He began chanting in a guttural language, runes swirling around his forearms. "Artisan's cataclysm, Ironsong quake." A wave of force exploded from him, splitting the floor in a jagged line. Chunks of stone flew upward in a deadly storm. The entire building shook. My illusions scattered, and I was thrown off balance, crashing into a rusted anvil. Sparks danced in my vision. I fought to stay conscious, summoning illusions to cloak me as I scrambled behind a partially collapsed wall. My breath came in ragged gasps. This man was summoning more powerful spells than I'd anticipated. Sienna was locked in her own battle, weaving around crossbow bolts as she flung shimmering ribbons of magic. The adventurer circled behind her, daggers raised. Time seemed to slow. The tradesman advanced, hammer raised, preparing a killing blow. The adventurer lunged at Sienna's exposed back. Panic flashed through me. I realized in that instant that I cared more about protecting Sienna, and preserving the teleporter for the sake of knowledge, than I did about my own life. The old me might have valued the artifact's secret above all else, but now, I had to act for something greater than just personal gain. With a roar, I forced myself to my feet and pressed a series of glyphs on the teleporter. "Guardian's Transit," I bellowed, a name I improvised on the spot. The device flared, arcs of purple light snaking around Sienna's form. In a blink, I swapped places with her. She found herself behind the collapsed wall, while I appeared in front of the adventurer's descending blades. Time resumed. Metal glinted. "No!" Sienna shrieked from across the room. The adventurer's daggers came down. I brought up both forearms to block, illusions swirling around them to form a faint barrier. Sparks flew as his blades met that half-real shield. Pain flared, blood trickled down my arms, but I stood my ground. Behind me, the tradesman held, swinging the hammer. The blow connected with my lower back, and I felt the world spin. But the illusions I clung to flared to life in a burst of bright purple sparks, pushing the outlaw's weapons off course just enough for me to avoid a fatal impact. I staggered, legs nearly giving out. "This ends now," I rasped, channeling the teleporter's swirling energy. In a final surge of desperation, I unleashed illusions that enveloped the entire forge in swirling skulls, this time tinted with green flames for added menace. A chorus of ghastly wails echoed, bouncing off the walls. The outlaws, remembering the illusions that once spooked them, panicked for a split second. That was all Sienna needed. She snapped her wrists, releasing a torrent of glowing threads that ensnared the tradesman's arms and legs. She pulled tight, and he toppled with a look of horror. The adventurer, eyes full of terror, darted out the door, colliding with 2 retreating guild members. I coughed, struggling to stay on my feet. "Sienna," I managed, the teleporter, locked them away. My vision blurred, but I saw her set her jaw, lifting a hand to conjure a shimmering barrier around the tradesman. He let out muffled curses, thrashing in the arcane threads. By the time the illusions faded, it was over. The guild was routed, some fleeing into the darkness, others captured in Sienna's binding. Exhaustion claimed me. I collapsed, drifting into a half-conscious state. I vaguely sensed Sienna's arms around me, dragging me away from the rubble. The night air felt cold on my sweat-soaked skin. Then all went black. I woke to the soft sound of crackling embers. I was in a safe house Sienna sometimes used, just a small cabin on the outskirts of Volzara. Dawn's first rays of light crept through a single window. My body ached all over, but a sense of relief washed through me as I realized we had survived. Not only survived, but triumphed. The tradesman was in custody, the guild's local cell scattered. The teleporter device lay on a table nearby, glowing with quiet contentment, as though it, too, had gained a sense of purpose. Sienna, nursing her own minor wounds, smiled as I stirred. "You were out for a while," she said softly. "But we did it." I turned the tradesman and his cohorts over to some honest members of the city guard, ones who aren't on the guild's payroll. "They're locked away." I managed a weary grin. "Then that's one less threat." A flutter of satisfaction filled me. "But we still have the teleporter. And the knowledge it holds." She nodded. "What will you do now?" For a moment, I gazed at the device, recalling the illusions, the glimpses of advanced spatial glyphs, the ephemeral figure who spoke of unwavering resolve. A swirl of conflicting emotions tugged at me. My old self would dive headfirst into the device's secrets, caring little for the consequences. But after all I had been through, I understood that harnessing the device responsibly would require patience and collaboration. My beliefs had shifted. "I'll continue to study it," I said quietly. "But not alone. I think I'll set up a small circle of researchers, maybe gather a few colleagues from the library who'd be open to genuine exploration without greed. We'll decipher its illusions, unravel its secrets. Carefully." I paused, turning to meet Sienna's gaze. "And I hope you'll help me. We can ensure this power doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Her face lit up with a sense of purpose. "I'd be honored, Elias." Warmth fluttered in my chest. The memory of that first day sneaking into the watchtower replayed in my mind, how I believed retrieving a broken teleporter was just a quick job, an easy path to hidden knowledge. It turned out to be so much more than that. I came away from it battered, bruised, but also transformed. My illusions, once a novelty, had become tools for both survival and for forging a new path. My thirst for knowledge, once an obsession, had grown into something tempered by responsibility. And though the outlaws, the adventurer and the tradesman, had tested me to my limits, I felt a strange empathy for them now. Each of them had sought something, whether gold or power or recognition. They lost themselves in that pursuit, becoming agents of violence. I could have gone down that same path if not for the stark lessons of reality. In the days that followed, I recovered my strength. Sienna and I returned to Volzara, seeing it anew. The guild's bounty on me had dissipated with the tradesman's arrest. City officials recognized that the teleporter was my rightful discovery, and while a few corrupt ones remained, they seemed disinclined to challenge the new equilibrium. With the immediate danger behind us, we quietly relocated to a safer district, a modest stone building with a hidden basement that would serve as our new research space. Strangely enough, rumors persisted that the adventurer outlaw was still at large, possibly plotting some form of revenge or looking for new ways to earn coin. But he remained out of sight. I hoped that perhaps he'd reflect on the events and see that reckless greed leads only to ruin. As for the tradesman, locked in the city dungeons, I heard that he raged constantly, cursing my name and vowing retribution on the entire city. But with time, maybe he, too, might learn something about the cost of unbridled ambition. Under the flicker of arcane lamps in our new laboratory, I placed the teleporter on a table. Sienna sat across from me, referencing old texts we had pulled from the library. The device's runes shimmered, waiting to be explored. A swirl of expectant energy pulsed, as if inviting us deeper into its illusions. We exchanged an excited look. This was only the beginning of unraveling its mysteries, mysteries that could reshape our understanding of teleportation and illusions for generations to come. But that was a matter for another day. For now, I took a quiet moment to reflect. My journey had begun with a single rumor of a broken artifact, and in pursuing it, I had nearly lost my life multiple times. I had faced cunning outlaws, tapped into illusions I never knew I could conjure, and confronted my own obsessive thirst for knowledge. In the end, I emerged with a more balanced sense of purpose, a new friend and partner in Sienna, and a teleporter that sparkled with hidden wonders. Maybe the greatest treasure I'd gained was not the device itself but the transformation it sparked in my soul. Before extinguishing the arcane lamps for the night, I gently ran my hand over the teleporter's surface. "Thank you," I whispered, unsure if I was speaking to the artifact, to the spirits who had guided me, or to my own inner resolve. The runes pulsed once, as if in acknowledgement. Then darkness settled over the hidden lab, and I let my mind drift to dreams of new possibilities, of forging illusions that weren't just for trickery, but to inspire wonder and protect those who sought knowledge for a better world. No longer was my desire for knowledge a shallow hunger. It had become a mission rooted in empathy and humility, with room to grow, to learn, and to discover. And so, battered but unbroken, I finally allowed myself true rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, and fresh wonders, worthy of the life I'd chosen. In that quiet, moonlit chamber, I found a measure of peace. The broken artifact was restored. The immediate threat was gone. And though countless questions remained, I felt ready to face them, illusions and all. My final thought before sleep claimed me was of the unstoppable swirl of the arcane, illusions that could shape reality, teleports that could bend space, and the once fragmented relic that was now whole and safe in my keeping. Indeed, it contained secrets waiting to be unveiled, secrets that I would someday unlock. But that is another story, best saved for a day when I have the strength to once again face the unknown with unwavering resolve. In the depths of that peaceful night, my story found its conclusion, and its promise of new beginnings.